Why? Why would he have done something like this? A couple of very bad decisions from the pilots is sometimes all it takes to cause an aircraft disaster. At least this is the way that the media portrays aircraft accidents. But is that really true? The story I will tell you today looks from the onset like exactly such a scenario, with almost unbelievable carelessness shown. But was it really that simple? Stay tuned. The flight crew, who would later find themselves in a true nightmare scenario, started that day at a hotel in Cairo, Egypt. The captain and first officer, who flew for the Middle Eastern carrier Gulf Air, had spent the previous night hanging out with other crew members and, in the captain's case, also gambling at a local casino. And while the captain had therefore stayed up until 3 a.m, their next flight wasn't due until the following afternoon, so he got plenty of sleep and reportedly woke up feeling well rested. The date was the 23rd of August, the year 2000, and their assigned trip on that day was Gulf Air's regular flight 072 from Cairo over to the small island nation of Bahrain, located east of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf. The aircraft that they were going to use was a nearly 6-year-old Airbus A320, which was in a great technical condition with no significant faults recorded on it. The weather was also reported as great along the route, with warm temperatures and not a cloud in the sky, so the pilots would have been expecting a relatively straightforward flight as they were going through their pre-flight briefing. The commander of the flight was a 37-year-old captain of Bahraini nationality who had accumulated 4,416 total hours over his 6-year career as a pilot with Gulf Air. He had originally joined the company as a flight engineer cadet at the age of just 17 back in 1979, and he then spent several years as a flight engineer on the Lockheed L-1011 before being promoted to first officer in 1994. After that, he was then transferred over to the Boeing 767 later that same year, and then further on to the Airbus A320 in 1998. Back to the 767 in 1999, and then finally again back to the Airbus A320 in January of the year 2000. He was then promoted to captain on the Airbus A320 on June the 17th that same year, but he subsequently took 3 weeks of vacation between July the 30th and August 19th, so as a result he had only accumulated 86 hours as a pilot in command by the time of this flight. Most pilots who had flown with the captain described him favorably, but he had only narrowly passed his upgrade check ride back in April after receiving some poor grades on 2 different emergency maneuvers. Some pilots also said that he had a tendency towards overconfidence and occasionally reacted poorly to suggestions from his first officers. Speaking of which, working as his first officer on this day was a 25-year-old Omani national who had only been flying the Airbus A320 for Gulf Air since April that same year, which meant that he had only accumulated a total of 608 hours. Now, his training record was quite spotty, and in fact he had initially failed his Airbus A320 proficiency check back in October of 1999 after receiving D grades on 7 different items, including VOR-DME approaches, normal landings, as well as automation technology. Captains who had flown with the first officer described him as timid, meek and slightly reserved, albeit keen to learn. And they also mentioned that he had shown some difficulty with handling unfamiliar situations, that he didn't ask clarifying questions and might hesitate to challenge the captain. One instructor had deliberately tested the first officer on that point by exceeding the taxi speed limits on purpose during a simulator session, just to see if the first officer would say something. But he didn't. It should also be mentioned that despite being very new to the job, the first officer already had a previous incident on his record. In January of 2000, while the first officer was undergoing line training under supervision, the aircraft he was flying had struck debris during takeoff from Abu Dhabi and was subsequently unable to pressurize. An internal Gulf Air investigation into that incident found that the flight crew displayed poor airmanship and awareness during the emergency, and the first officer ended up being sent for 2 days of remedial training because of this. Now, I want to really emphasize here that this is how an airline should react if knowledge deficiencies are found out. You see, providing extra training and then possibly following up with some extra line checks is standard procedures when a pilot has committed errors that weren't done on purpose. That really just forms part of a just culture where people shouldn't be punished if they've done something, but they didn't mean to. Anyway, despite the first officer's record, he had now been placed with a very new captain with little command experience, and that would not happen at most major airlines today. Now, Gulf Air did have a probationary period for new captains, during which time they couldn't fly with inexperienced first officers, but this period originally lasted only 40 flights, and in 1999 the company had then cut that down even further to just 20 flights. So at the time of this flight, there were no restrictions on who this captain could fly with. Now, if it seems strange to you that Gulf Air would roll back a safety measure, you wouldn't be alone in thinking so. And to explain what was really going on here, we need to look a little bit closer at this airline, which I will soon do. But the truth is that they are far from the only ones rolling back safety features. Did you know that, for example, you are not getting the same internet experience as everyone else out there? The fact is that you are likely also paying different prices for stuff that you buy online, and you are definitely not getting the same search results. All because your behavior is being tracked and used by all sorts of different companies out there, and sometimes even sold. That is one of the many reasons I am so happy to have NordVPN as today's sponsor, and you should really check them out if you haven't already. I only allow sponsors that I use myself and that I think will benefit you, my audience, and in the case of NordVPN, that's because they help shield my data and avoid companies building profiles on me. Nord also offers powerful cybersecurity tools like their Threat Protection Pro, which blocks malicious websites, trackers, and even warns me about sketchy pages before I even click on them. NordVPN have servers in over 60 different countries, making their service super fast, which is great when you want to stream your favorite sports, shows, and safely access your bank, for example, from basically everywhere. And like I said, I think of you guys when I accept these sponsorships, which is why Nord is offering my viewers 4 extra months for free when you use this QR code or go to nordvpn.com/pilot and sign up for their 2-year plan. And you don't really risk anything since Nord always offers you a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you, Nord, for helping us create these videos. Now, let's get back to Gulf Air and their safety culture. Now, Gulf Air was originally a subsidiary of the British Overseas Airways Corporation, the forebearer to British Airways, until in 1973, when a majority stake was purchased jointly by the governments of Bahrain, Qatar, Oman and the Emirate of Abu Dhabi, which later became part of the UAE. The airline then acted as a joint flag carrier for all of those countries, with routes stretching from New York to Australia. Officially, the airline was registered in Oman, placing it under the authority of the Oman Directorate General of Civil Aviation and Meteorology, or DGCAM, while its chairmanship was rotated yearly between nationals of its stakeholder countries. During the 1990s, Gulf Air then started to encounter some financial difficulties, and that's where things started to take a very unfortunate turn. Records from the Oman DGCA show that during this period, regulators sent numerous letters to Gulf Air concerning violations by the airline, many of which received no reply or was just inadequately corrected. Gulf Air was subsequently sanctioned repeatedly for violations in areas ranging from flight operations, duty time limit exceedances, flight training and record keeping, among many other things. And these sanctions included restrictions of its extended twin-engine operations, or ETOPS authorization, revocation of its right to carry out 3-engine ferry flights on its 4-engine Airbus A340s, as well as suspension of several flight crew licenses. DGCA inspectors assigned to Gulf Air noted that the airline had no crew resource management training program, no quality management program, no safety awareness program, and were also lacking several other critical items required under the Oman civil aviation regulations. Now, not only was communication with Gulf Air on these issues drawn out and difficult, a later audit also found that the company expressed opposition to the existence of many of these regulations in the first place. In fact, during this time, instead of trying to comply, the company was actively reducing the number of safety programs that they had in place. For example, back in 1992, Gulf Air had started an in-house CRM training program in order to improve teamwork in the cockpit, but that was then discontinued in 1996 and replaced with nothing. The airline's human factors manager tried to organize a new CRM training program, but was totally unable to make any progress, so he just resigned, only for his replacement to come across the very same problem. Now, what all of this shows us is that Gulf Air's management seemed to have a really problematic attitude towards flight safety. And it looks like Gulf Air executives might have been viewing safety as a cost to be minimized, instead of recognizing that safety programs like these tend to save money in the long term. As the saying goes, if you think safety is expensive, try having an accident. Now, in 1999, Oman then introduced a requirement for all airlines in the country to have CRM training programs, at which point Gulf Air basically just complied and contracted a third party to implement one by May of 2000. But then a contractual dispute delayed its development, and by the time of this flight, the training still hadn't started yet. That meant that since both pilots of Flight 072 were trained ab initio in-house by Gulf Air, neither had ever received any real CRM training, which is a fact that is going to become super important to this story. But that wasn't the only crucial training that they had missed. Gulf Air also didn't include normal go-arounds in its recurrent simulator training program, nor did it provide pilots with continuous simulator training on how to respond to ground proximity warnings. And that's also worth remembering here. So overall, I would say that the quality of training that these pilots had received was probably a bit below the standard that should have been expected, and soon we will see the consequences of that. Back in Cairo, while the pilots were preparing their aircraft for departure, the 6 cabin crew oversaw the boarding of the flight's 135 passengers, eventually leading to a total of 143 souls on board. Now, the flight was originally scheduled to depart at 1600 hours local time, but the pilots only arrived to the aircraft shortly before that. The crew of the previous flight reported that the captain had seemed angry when he arrived, and that he had told them that they were late because some company ground personnel had told them to go to the wrong gate. As a result, the flight eventually departed 52 minutes late, pushing its expected arrival time to well past 1900, by which time it would be fully dark in Bahrain. Anyway, the pilots proceeded with setting up the aircraft, and after a completely normal departure, the flight soon continued its climb up to its cruising altitude and then proceeded uneventfully towards its destination, crossing over the Arabian Peninsula with the sun setting behind them. The captain was acting as the pilot flying and the first officer as pilot monitoring for the whole flight, and there are no indications that anything out of the ordinary happened during the cruise phase of the flight. Eventually, though, Flight 072 started getting closer to the destination and they began their descent while within the Dammam air traffic control sector in Saudi Arabia. And this is where we will pick up the sequence of events at time 1921 as the aircraft descended through 14,000 feet. Dammam approach control soon cleared Flight 072 to proceed on its own discretion directly towards the initial approach fix for runway 12 at Bahrain International Airport, and the controller also told them to descend to 3,500 feet and to contact Bahrain approach. The first officer immediately read this back and then called up Bahrain approach to report their position. When the new controller heard this, he asked the flight to confirm that they had been cleared down to 3,500 feet, which was standard for the aircraft transitioning over from Dammam. But the captain had apparently misheard that previous clearance and told the first officer to report that they were only cleared to 7,000 feet. And the first officer did this without any type of protest. In response, the Bahrain controller simply again told them to continue their descent down to 3,500 feet, but somewhere around here, and possibly even before, Flight 072 had started to acquire some quite excessive indicated airspeed, well above 300 knots, which is something that would soon come to have a profound effect on what's about to happen. The final report isn't super clear about why this excessive speed was allowed to develop, but one possible contributing factor is that the captain misunderstood that previous clearance, which might have caused him to descend too slowly at first, only to then pitch down and allow the speed to build up in order to catch up with their intended descent profile. It is also possible that the direct to clearance that they had received earlier towards the final approach fix had cut down their available track miles and therefore led them to be high. In any case, there were no operational or ATC related reason why such a high speed would be necessary, since there was no other traffic in the area and plenty of space available to descend. No, instead, it seems likely that the captain might have deliberately used a higher than normal speed here in a misguided attempt to make up for being late or to impress his brand new first officer. In fact, during the descent, the captain had tried to show off his ability to quickly set up the navigational system for the approach without the first officer even noticing, which he then bragged about. Anyway, this excessive speed was then maintained as the aircraft descended down below 10,000 feet, where a speed limit of 250 knots would normally be enforced in most parts of the world. But Bahrain didn't have any official speed limit at low altitudes. And whilst most airlines enforced its 250 knot limit internally anyway, even in countries that doesn't really formally require it, Gulf Air had no such policy. Now technically the pilots were supposed to check with air traffic control before flying faster than 250 knots anyway, but that didn't happen. Instead, the flight was now cleared down to 1,500 feet, and at time 1925 the captain started maneuvering to intercept the final approach fix for the non-precision VOR DME approach to Bahrain's runway 12. A VOR DME approach uses a very high-frequency omnidirectional range radio beacon to define the approach course, which the pilots then can use and track with their instruments to align precisely for the runway. The VOR doesn't provide vertical guidance like an instrument landing system does, so instead the pilots will track their distance from the airport's distance measuring equipment, or DME, and then start their descent at predetermined distances according to the approach charts. In bad weather, a VOR DME is less precise than an ILS and can therefore be a bit trickier to fly, especially in bad weather. But on this day, the weather wasn't an issue at all, since the visibility was almost unlimited. According to the approach chart for this particular approach, Flight 072 would need to use the VOR to align with the runway at a minimum distance of 9 nautical miles from the DME station and at a platform height of 1,500 feet. In this case, the DME station was situated 2 nautical miles beyond the far end of the airport, so if you want to compare DME distances to the remaining track miles to the runway, you have to subtract 2. Now that's not super important for this story, but just something that I wanted to mention in order to avoid some confusion as we continue. Now, after aligning with the VOR at 9 DME, the chart called for level flight at 1,500 feet until reaching 7 DME, at which point the pilots could initiate a steady descent down towards the runway. According to Gulf Air's standard operating procedures, when flying a non-precision approach like this, the pilots had to configure the aircraft fully for landing before reaching the final approach fix, which in this case was that 7 DME point. Since non-precision approaches are generally more complicated to fly and require more focus, most airlines at the time had this SOP to enable the pilots to fully focus on the navigation once the descent was initiated. For the Airbus A320, that meant that the flaps needed to be set to full, the landing gear needed to be down, and in this case, they also needed to maintain an altitude of 1,500 feet prior to the fix. On top of that, the indicated speed could not be more than 5 knots below or 10 knots above the calculated approach speed, which for Flight 072 was set at 136 knots. If these parameters were met, well, then the approach would have been allowed to continue, at least down until something that we refer to as the approach gate. Under the stabilized approach concept, an approach is considered stabilized if, upon reaching the approach gate, the aircraft is in the landing configuration, the thrust levers are set correctly, the the speed, course and altitudes are correct, and only minor control inputs will be needed in order to land in the touchdown zone. At Gulf Air, that approach gate for a VOR DME approach was at 1,000 feet above the runway, which would normally be reached at just above 5 DME on this particular approach, meaning about 3 miles from the runway. Now, the correct thing to do is to go around if the company's stabilized approach criteria can't be met by the approach gate, but Gulf Air's manuals just said that the pilots should consider going around in that scenario, which seems to imply, improperly of course, that the pilots had a choice to continue instead. Anyway, we don't know exactly how much that particular issue had any influence here, but what we do know is that it should have been obvious from a very early stage that this particular approach would not be stabilized by 1,000 feet. During the descent, the captain extended the speed brakes a couple of times in order to try and slow the aircraft down, but he didn't use them to their fullest extent. And by the time the pilots had intercepted the landing course at 9 DME, they were still at 1,873 feet, instead of the required 1,500 feet, and their airspeed was still at an absolutely insane 313 knots. At that point, the correct thing to do would have been to request a nice big 360-degree orbit, or a holding pattern, or maybe even some radar vectors, and then they would have been able to use those extra track miles to properly slow down and descend to the correct altitude. If that would have been done, that might have added another 5 minutes or so to the flight, but that would have been it. But the captain didn't want to do that. In fact, these pilots never even discussed that possibility. Instead, the captain simply extended the speed brakes again and continued barreling onwards towards the final approach fix without saying anything about how he was going to deal with the situation. One of the consequences of flying at such high speeds is that the timeline where you need to act and do things during the approach becomes really compressed. And that can make it really easy to fall behind the aircraft and therefore make the situation even more complicated. The first officer's job here, since he was pilot monitoring, should have been to point out that the approach was unlikely to succeed and suggest an alternative course of action, or at least express that he was uncomfortable with what he was seeing. But this poor first officer, who, remember, had no CRM training to teach him strategies for speaking up, just remained silent. In fact, at no point during this flight did the first officer do anything except respond to instructions from the captain and read checklist items. He never provided any original input, and the captain never really asked for any either. That left the captain basically flying solo, which is not what you want in the type of high workload situation that can develop when you're too fast on approach, as we will soon see. Anyway, as Flight 072 approached the final approach fix at 7 DME, the captain now instructed the first officer to report that they were established on the VOR DME approach. And when he did, the Bahrain approach controller responded by handing them over to the tower controller, who immediately cleared the aircraft to land. The first officer read this back, and Flight 072 now passed the final approach fix at 7 DME, which meant that the captain could start descending down towards the runway. At this point, the plane was not in the approach configuration at all. The landing gear had just been extended, but the captain was only calling for flaps 1, and their airspeed was at 224 knots, and their altitude at 1,678 feet, so still almost 200 feet too high. Now, the Airbus A320 has 5 flap settings, starting with 0, meaning retracted, 1, 2, 3 and full, where flaps full was normally used for landing in Gulf Air. But each flap stage must be selected below a certain indicated speed, because at higher speeds the aerodynamical pressure on the flaps could otherwise be too great. That's why the crew had been unable to extend the flaps to the landing position before reaching the final approach fix. And they were now in a position where it was impossible to configure fully for landing before reaching the approach gate, since there just wasn't enough time left to slow down. Instead, as the flight approached 1,000 feet, the captain announced that he was now visual with the airfield, and therefore, in his mind, he had switched from an instrument approach to a visual approach. You see, when flying visually with the runway in sight, the approach gate can be brought down to 500 feet instead of 1,000 feet. So he likely tried to just buy himself some extra time here by using that rule. But at this point, their airspeed was still at 207 knots, over 70 knots too high, and the flaps were still only in position 1. The captain announced that they had to be stabilized by 500 feet, and he then ordered the first officer to select flaps 2, but within the next 15 seconds, he finally started to realize the inevitable, and at time 1927, he declared, "We're not going to make it." Of course, this was a very unsurprising conclusion, something that he could have very easily avoided by slowing down further out or asking for more track miles, but his overconfidence had now led him to this crossroad. And to be perfectly honest here, most pilots have been in similar situations at some time during their career. I definitely know that I have. Standard procedure at this point would have been to just execute a normal go-around, which for this approach was as simple as just to climb straight ahead following the runway heading to 2,500 feet and then return to the start of the approach for another attempt. But instead of doing that, the captain just allowed the descent to continue for a short period while he decided on a proper course of action. And then he disconnected the autopilot, turned off the flight directors, and told the first officer to request a 360-degree left orbit. Now it has to be emphasized here that once you have passed the final approach fix, the only permitted maneuver are to either continue for landing, go around, or possibly circle to land on the reciprocal runway if that has been pre-briefed. An orbit on final approach is not standard practice and should not be attempted since visual maneuvers outside of the ones that I just mentioned must be conducted above the minimum safe altitude, which in this case was 1,500 feet. And in most cases, airlines have even more stringent rules about 360s than that. Now the reason for this is that it's just plain risky to do something like this since it normally just destabilizes the approaches even further. And most transport aircraft aren't really designed to perform complex maneuvers in full landing configuration either. So all around, this was a pretty bad idea. Now the first officer should have spoken up here and said something like, "Hey, I think we should just go around." And if he would have done that, it is likely that the captain would have listened to him. You see, we captains can sometimes get very deep into the get-there-itis, and we actually appreciate when the pilot monitoring speaks up and offers a voice of reason. But instead, this first officer just continued to say nothing, and the captain therefore started to execute a fully manual 360-degree orbit on final approach on a moonless night, partially over water at less than 600 feet above the ground. Now, I want to stop here and ask a really important question. Why do you think a pilot would choose to do something like this? Why would he disregard rules, regulations, and plain common sense? Well, the answer, it turns out, is that there are several factors that can lead to intentional non-compliance with SOPs and rules, and all of them were in play here. Now, of course, the captain's history of overconfidence and penchant for showing off may have predisposed him to take risks. After all, he was new to his role and he may have felt a bit embarrassed about his failure to stabilize the approach under these nearly perfect weather and visibility conditions. In such situations, a go-around can feel like admitting to failure, which can be difficult to do for some people. But studies have also shown that pilots can intentionally deviate from SOPs if everybody does it, or if the SOP is not perceived as realistic. In other words, it's part of the company culture. Or they might also do it in an attempt to optimize things like time, fuel consumption, or workload. Now, violation for any of these reasons become more likely under 4 main conditions. First, the expectation that the rule will have to be bent in order to get the job done. Secondly, high confidence in one's own ability to accomplish the task. Third, the presence of opportunities to do things more efficiently than the procedure allows. And fourth, inadequate planning, forcing problem solving on the fly. And as it turns out, all of these risk factors were present here. First of all, according to air traffic controllers, some Gulf Air flights had occasionally done orbits on final approach in the past, so the captain was probably aware that there were informal precedents for doing this. Secondly, an orbit instead of doing a go-around would obviously save both time and fuel. And third, the crew had not recently discussed the go-around procedure or what criteria they would need in order to go around. So, in other words, insufficient planning. There was no trace on the cockpit voice recorder of a proper briefing, but of course the recording was only 30 minutes long, so it could have happened earlier. Anyway, what I think is by far the most important external factor here was the company culture. You see, whilst Gulf Air insisted that no pilots were ever to be punished for going around from an unstable approach, they still required pilots to submit a report about the reason for the go-around if they did one. Now, not only was this extra paperwork probably pretty annoying to do, but it also led to the perception among some Gulf Air pilots that the airline viewed go-arounds unfavorably. And that, right there, is absolutely unacceptable. Anytime pilots develop that impression, even if they're wrong, the airline needs to take clear and unambiguous action to dispel those type of worries. Because when pilots feel pressure not to go around, they will start taking risks to avoid them. So if you imagine yourself in the captain's shoes here, you've just messed up this approach by flying too fast for no real reason, and you're now unstabilized. But if you go around, you'll have to submit paperwork explaining to your boss why you couldn't land on a nice long runway with unlimited visibility, minimal wind and no other traffic, and a perfectly functioning aircraft. So why subject yourself to all of that when you could just do an orbit instead to get back on track and just land? Does it make a little bit more sense to you now? Yeah. Anyway, one way that the airlines can prevent this kind of thing is by monitoring flight data over their fleet for unusual signals or exceedances of certain parameters. This is called a flight data monitoring program, and it can be super useful to detect when pilots are routinely violating SOPs in situations that wouldn't otherwise be reported. Now, those kind of programs allows airlines to identify the root causes of violations and change their policies in order to incentivize the correct actions. But Gulf Air's flight data monitoring program only existed on paper. The airline had even purchased its planes with quick access data recorders installed to facilitate this kind of monitoring, but they had never been turned on. So this is basically a great example of how airline policies and culture can play a huge role in pilot decision making and explain why certain seemingly inexplicable decisions are taken. Anyway, in the Bahrain control tower, a trainee controller was operating the tower position under supervision when Flight 072 called up to request that orbit. At this point, Flight 072 had not reported that they were visual, so as far as the controller knew, they were still flying the VOR approach, where such a maneuver was definitely not allowed. So strictly speaking, the controller should have denied this request and just ordered their flights to execute a go-around instead, but both the trainee controller and his supervisor didn't really recognize the problem and instead just approved the request for that 360 turn. So the captain now finally started turning left to begin the orbit, while positioned just 0.9 nautical miles short of the runway threshold, which is just insane. At this point, their altitude was still 584 feet, with an airspeed of 177 knots, meaning that they were still over 100 feet too high and 40 knots too fast. As the captain held the plane in the turn, he told the first officer to first select flaps 2, then flaps 3, and then finally flaps full, and after having done that, the first officer called out that the landing checklist was now complete. The captain was now flying the plane manually in full high-drag landing configuration, which was quite difficult because even the fly-by-wire Airbus A320 doesn't handle very well with full flaps in level flight and in a turn. And to make matters even worse, Bahrain Airport is located on a small island in the Persian Gulf, so as the left turn progressed, the airplane soon passed over the airport and out over the water, which was pitch black, since the sun had set and the moon hadn't yet risen. Since the captain had turned off the autopilot and the flight directors, he was now flying visually, and he soon found himself forced to glance back and forth between his instruments and out the window in search for a reference point. The flight data shows that he was having difficulty controlling the plane in both roll and pitch, and he might have started to become disoriented already at this point. During the orbit, their altitude fluctuated wildly from as low as 332 feet to as high as 965 feet, and they repeatedly exceeded the normal 25-degree maximum bank angle, reaching a maximum of 36 degrees of left bank. In the tower, the controllers were somewhat concerned by Flight 072's erratic flight path, but as the flight neared the runway centerline, the tower reissued the landing clearance anyway. At that moment, the first officer declared runway in sight as the airport lights became visible again off to their left. And when catching sight of the lights, the captain instinctively leveled the wings in order to regain his bearings and determine his position relative to the runway. But he did so way too early. The airplane was now flying almost 90 degrees off the approach course, soon passing a beam the runway threshold, which was near their 10 o'clock position. The captain started cursing and announced, "We overshot it!" at which point he resumed the left turn and also started pushing the thrust up. Clicking his tongue in frustration, he then told the first officer to call the tower up and announced that they were now finally going around. At the time the go-around was initiated, the captain was probably already somewhat disoriented and definitely quite stressed, not only by the difficulty of the maneuver, but likely also by his failure to achieve the intended goal. So far, everything the captain had tried only seemed to make their situation worse, and now that he had finally decided to bail out, he found himself doing so from a highly abnormal position. When we humans are under a lot of stress, the likelihood of making errors increases significantly, and sometimes those errors compound, making the situation more stressful, which makes errors even more likely until things start to spiral completely out of control. And that is exactly what now happened over the coming 55 seconds. Now, during a go-around, the pilot should apply go-around thrust, pitch up to about 15 degrees, retract the flaps to position 3, verify positive climb, and then retract the landing gear. These are memory items, so the pilots need to know them by heart. But in this case, not only did Gulf Air pilots not practice normal go-arounds in recurrent simulator training, the high stress and their unusual position relative to the runway would likely have made it more difficult for the pilots to recall those memory items while still trying to maneuver the aircraft. Initially, the captain started pulling back on his side stick, reaching a pitch up of almost 14 degrees, but instead of holding it there, he then started steadily, likely instinctively, pitching the nose back down again, below 10 degrees as he continued the left-hand turn. Meanwhile, he also called for go-around flaps, and at the same time, in response to the first officer's go-around call, the tower asked if they would like radar vectors back for another approach. The captain answered yes, and the first officer replied as such, whilst also moving the flap lever back to position 3 like the captain had asked for. The captain then also called for the gear to be retracted, and the first officer complied, but the aircraft still continued turning left, past the runway centerline, instead of following the published go-around procedure, which was to follow the runway heading straight ahead. Now, we don't know why that happened, but it might have been in anticipation of the imminent radar vectors back onto the approach, or the captain was now getting so task-saturated that he was missing that the aircraft was still turning. At the same time, he kept applying subtle, probably subconscious forward pressure on his side stick, causing the nose to slowly drop towards 6 degrees, way below the go-around pitch attitude of 15 degrees. It's worth noting here that during a go-around with the flight director engaged, the flight director overlay on the primary flight display would have indicated the target pitch angle of 15 degrees. But because he had turned the flight directors off during the orbit, there was now no target pitch shown. Most likely the captain was not even aware that he was making these nose-down inputs, because he would have been focused on turning the plane and calling for the go-around configuration. And what happens when an aircraft starts pitching down with go-around thrust set? Yes, it starts accelerating. Now, in a disoriented state, an increase in forward acceleration can feel very similar to an increase in pitch. And that's because both forces pushes you in the same direction relative to your seat, basically back into it. And the vestibular system in our inner ears cannot determine the difference between those two feelings. The only way that our brains have in order to separate these two feelings is by outside visual references like a horizon or the attitude indicator. This type of sensory confusion is called a somatogravic illusion, and it has caused several accidents over the years involving pitched down inputs during a go-around. So in this case, as the captain became more stressed and task-saturated by this complex series of maneuvers, he also started to become more susceptible to the effects of somatogravic illusion. As the engine spooled up the toga thrust, the low pitch angle resulted in more and more acceleration, which would have also added to that illusion with each passing second. The first officer now made the standard positive climb and gear up callouts, and at the exact same moment he did so, the controller instructed them to fly on heading 300 degrees and also to climb to 2,500 feet. The first officer correctly read this back, and the captain asked him to repeat the heading, which he also did. The first officer then asked whether they should turn right or left to the captain, but the captain just did not respond. In fact, he had now started to level the plane off on a heading of 040 degrees instead of the cleared 300 degrees. Just 2 seconds later, before anyone could clarify the situation, a continuous, repetitive chime suddenly started blaring, warning the pilots that the plane was now exceeding the maximum speed of 185 knots for flaps in position 3. The first officer exclaimed that they were over the speed limit, and as he did that, the tower instructed them to now contact Bahrain approach again. The first officer read this back, but the captain just let out a swear word. He was likely now far down the stress cone. As all of this was happening, the aircraft proceeded out beyond the limits of Bahrain Airport and towards the pitch black Persian Gulf. And that suddenly meant that the captain would now only see a complete blackness outside of his windows. Within 2 seconds after this loss of visual references, he now started pushing forward even more on his side stick, causing the nose to rapidly drop below the horizon until it reached a terrifying -15 degrees, the maximum pitch down allowed by the Airbus A320's flight envelope protections. The timing here was not coincidental, as the loss of visual references greatly increases the effects of somatogravic illusion. Now, he still had his instruments working in front of him, but he doesn't seem to have looked much at those. As this was occurring, the first officer called out, "Speed checks, flaps 3, and the captain replied by ordering, "Flaps up." So he was still there, somewhat, even though he obviously weren't handling the aircraft correctly. But then, the stress rose even further when the ground proximity warning system, the GPWS, suddenly realized the aircraft's ground closure rate and started calling out
"Sink rate,"
followed by several
"Pull up."
Now, the only correct way to respond to this particular warning is to immediately pull the nose up as far as the flight envelope protections would allow, make sure that the thrust is set fully forward and that the speed brakes are retracted. But here, none of the pilots reacted to it at all. So, what was going on? Well, the final report actually used a great analogy to help us understand that. You see, you have to think of the human brain as a one-channel processor. It can only handle so many things at a time before it reaches capacity, and then nothing new can get through. In situations of extreme stress, where many different stimuli are coming at us in a short period of time, the brain can engage in what's known as load shedding, in which it simply stops processing certain stimuli according to an instinctive hierarchy of importance. In many cases, audio processing, hearing, is one of the first things to go, which is why sounds can feel muffled or dull during moments of extreme panic, fear or confusion. So most likely, as more and more stress factors piled on to the captain, he actually lost his ability to perceive new auditory stimuli, which physically prevented him from hearing the ground proximity warnings. This type of situation can be prevented by rigorously drilling in the response to GPWS warnings, the terrain escape maneuver, in a simulator, since doing that retrains the subconscious brain to give those warnings a higher priority. But of course, Gulf Air hadn't provided a sufficient amount of that type of training for these pilots. Now, the first officer's workload was much lower here, since he wasn't responsible for hand flying the airplane, so it's hard to believe that he was so overloaded that he couldn't hear those warnings. But Because Gulf Air didn't provide ongoing training on either GPWS response or flap overspeed situations, it's possible that the first officer didn't really know which of these warnings presented a greater threat. Overspeeding the flaps isn't really a direct safety threat, but if he thought that it was, well then he would have faced a tough choice on deciding which warning to address first. That choice was made for him though, because the captain remained focused on the overspeed warning, and in fact, as the first officer called out "gears up" and started to mention the flaps, the captain now called "flaps all the way," still with the GPWS blaring in the background. When the confused and unassertive first officer saw the captain address the flap issue first, it's likely that he didn't even question whether this was the highest priority. He again just accepted it. Now, he probably didn't believe that his captain could fly the aircraft straight down into the water, but in fact, that's exactly what was now happening. And by failing to intervene and prompt the captain, or possibly even to take over the controls, the fate of this aircraft was now sealed. In the final seconds, the captain started pitching up slightly, but this was most likely a reaction to the captain's own disorientation rather than to the GPWS warnings. The last word on the cockpit voice recorder was the first officer announcing that flaps 0 had been set, and then it was all over. 2 seconds later, with nose down pitch of 6 degrees and an airspeed of 282 knots, Flight 072 slammed into the Persian Gulf, completely destroying the airplane, and all 143 souls on board were instantly lost. In the aftermath of this accident, it would have been easy for the investigators to write it off as yet another case of crew spatial disorientation during a go-around. There have since been several tragic accidents of this type where a pilot becomes disoriented and makes nose-down inputs during a go-around, including, but not limited to, Fly Dubai Flight 981 in 2016, Tatarstan Airways Flight 363 from 2013, and Armavia Flight 967 back in 2006, which I have previously shown on this channel. But to the investigators' credit, this investigation examined not only all of the factors that led to the flight crew's loss of situational and spatial awareness, but also the reasons behind the bad decisions that got them there in the first place. Intentional deviations from SOPs can seem in the moment like a good idea, but it's normally very hard to accurately assess the risks associated with leaving the safety net that those procedures provide. Especially in situations where the margins are already thin, like during a landing or a go-around. Once we stop operating inside of those defined procedures, we risk getting ourselves into very complex and unanticipated situations that might exceed our ability, no matter how skilled we believe ourselves to be. But what this investigation clearly showed was that this was much more complex than just pilots disregarding rules. Nobody violates this many SOPs in a vacuum. It was found that Gulf Air had contributed to this accident by ignoring and even eliminating training programs that would have helped the first officer to speak up, encouraged the pilots to maintain a more sensible airspeed, eased the captain's go-around decision, and improved the pilot's response to the flap overspeed and GPWS warnings. The airline also failed to implement policies that could have avoided the pairing of two weak and inexperienced pilots together, as well as programs that could have monitored their own flight operations to find any worrying trends. In the aftermath of the accident, several key personnel at Gulf Air and the Oman DGCA resigned, and contractors were brought in to help overhaul the airline's entire safety culture. Gulf Air temporarily suspended its instructor appointment and its ab initio training program in order to make major improvements to both processes. And the airline also introduced CRM training, more training on go-arounds, new procedures related to speed management and the stabilized approach concept, as well as visual maneuvering. They also moved to ensure that pilots would no longer perceive pressure to avoid go-arounds, and they installed an Airbus-approved modification that causes the flight director to automatically re-engage when go-around mode is activated. The anti-safety mindset that once plagued Gulf Air's top management was purged during several periods of leadership turnover, which involved a major scaling back of the company's operations as all countries except Bahrain rescinded their joint ownership. Gulf Air still exists today as the flag carrier of Bahrain, but since the tragedy of Flight 072, it hasn't had any more serious accidents. Now, if you like this story, then you should definitely watch this video next. And make sure that you also follow us on Spotify and join us on Patreon. I would love to see you in my next hangout. My name is Petter Hörnfeldt and you're watching Mentour Pilot. Have an absolutely fantastic day and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.